Welcome to Construyendo País, the podcast of the Javeriana Center on Government and Public Ethics, a permanent international forum where we explore ideas and perspectives of experts who address current issues of national and international politics and governance. Each episode will immerse you in interesting topics around governance, public ethics, leadership, national and international public policy. Get ready to expand your mind and discover new perspectives. Let's build together the future we want for Colombia.
Welcome to the first episode in English of our podcast, Construyendo País, from the Javeriana Center on Government and Public Ethics. Today we have a very special guest, Padre George Williams, who currently resides in San Francisco, California, and is working in San Quintin Prison. George Williams graduated from Syracuse University in 1979 with a dual degree in political science and communications. He felt called to work in prison ministry, so he went to volunteer at the Boston City Jail in 1993 and was immediately hired as their Catholic chaplain. Since then, he has dedicated his service to the prison population. He has an MSW from Boston College, master's degree in divinity from Western Jesuit School of Theology, and he has a PhD in criminology from Northeastern University. Father Williams, welcome. I am honored to have you in this episode. I want to give a bit of context to our audience. Your research has been focused on prisons in the U.S., and you requested to visit a prison here in Bogota to see what it was like compared to prisons in the U.S. I was able to share this experience with you, and it was my first time visiting a prison, actually. I want to make you a few questions regarding that experience. So in the first hand, what were some of the first aspects that you noticed that could resemble or were similar to an American prison? I know you have visited several due to your investigation and your service.
Mm-hmm. First of all, thank you, Mariana, for this opportunity to speak about the experience. I'm grateful to have had the chance to visit La Modelo. And I'd say my first impression was that it wasn't all that different from San Quentin. Prison is prison. So many things, so many aspects of what I saw that day remind me of daily life in San Quentin prison as well. Probably the most startling thing that I first saw that was different was a big statue of the Virgin Mary in the corridor entering the prison. That's something that I cannot imagine in one of our prisons. And it left me with two feelings. One is, what is Mary doing here? And on one hand, it seemed kind of strange and out of place. And yet on the other, as a priest, I have always found God and the Spirit in prison, so it really should not have surprised me too much to see Mary there as well.
Well, thank you. So what were some of the aspects that differed from an American prison that you could notice?
I think the main difference perhaps was that the prisoners seemed to, there were not a lot of people in programs. I had the impression that I did not see as many prisoners around as I expected. Perhaps they were in their cells doing other things. But the ones who were involved in programs, whether it was in classrooms or in artistic kinds of programs where they were making things or they were woodworking, things like that, that's very similar to the programs that we have in San Quentin. The classrooms seemed very similar. The structure of the building seemed very similar. The feel of the guards, was a little different in that I found, at least perhaps because I was a foreigner visiting, they were very polite. They're not so polite where I work as a rule, but the feel was similar. It's a military kind of environment. There's a sort of machismo element to working in those sorts of prisons. One thing that was very different, that I did not see any women guards, whereas at San Quentin, perhaps a quarter of the guards are, and so, which is problematic, having women working in a men's prison or men working in a women's prison. But it's because of our laws, that's everyone has the opportunity to do that. So that was a difference. But like I said, prison is prison. The feel of the place was very, very similar to what I feel walking into San Quentin. The sort of the stone, the kind of harshness of the environment. I don't know if there's any way to avoid doing that, but there's something about prisons with the metal and the concrete that just it makes it feel very sterile in some ways. And yet, within both prisons, there's a lot of life. And I saw gardening. I saw various types of programs where the prisoners were being allowed to be creative. And we had that as well. So what I was most impressed with was how the prisoners here are afforded the opportunity to participate in education and programming. It was very unlike a documentary that I had viewed prior to visiting, had been made by by Spanish television several years ago when they were visiting La Modelo. And at that time, it was extremely crowded, very violent. The place, what I saw that day was nothing like I saw in the documentary. Many fewer prisoners, and the ones who were there seemed very peaceful.
I agree. I definitely agree with you. And regarding what you just mentioned about the activities for the inmates, we saw inmates doing all sorts of things like gardening, carpentry, recycling, stuffed animals, clothes, bakery. We even saw a presentation of an orchestra, and the guards mentioned that there was a rock band as well. We also were told that the interns had access to education, preschool, middle school, high school, technical and college education and computing. Do you think that they have that diversity in American prisons as well?
It depends on the location and the prison. San Quentin is unique in that we are in the San Francisco Bay Area, surrounded by universities and kind of progressive-minded people. And so there's always been a lot of attention given to the conditions of the prisoners in San Quentin, whereas if you go to prisons that are more remote locations of the state, there are very few programs provided and also very few volunteers. So I think I'm somewhat, I don't know what the right word is, spoiled working at a place like San Quentin because we have such a wealth of programs. That's not the case in all of our prisons by any means. So it was the fact that you had a comparable number of programs going on was impressive to me.
Okay, yeah, that's really good. I thought that was really a positive aspect.
And I think the fact that you have members of the university here who are actively involved in programming at the prison, as we do in San Quentin, makes a big difference as well. In a sense, it forces the system to accommodate more than just punishment.
Yeah. But one thing that we saw was that not all of the inmates were doing those activities.
Right.
There were a lot of different things that they could do. However, they decided to stay in the patio because they have like different sectors where the prisoners are at. And a lot of them stayed there and they didn't want to be part of the activities. So why do you think that is?
Well, one of the things that I've experienced working with prisoners for almost 30 years is that people change when they're ready to change. Most of the prisoners I saw were fairly young. There was one section of tercera edad, but which was good that they had them segregated like that because they're more vulnerable. But I thought for the most part they were younger prisoners, and I think very often they come to prison without a sense of purpose, without a sense of maturity. And there's sort of an awakening that occurs after 5 or 10 years in prison where they kind of wake up one morning and realize they don't want to live this way anymore. And then they want to begin to change. And that's when we're able to provide them programs that help them do that. But if someone is not of the mindset to change or not willing to change or not mature enough to change, you could give them all the programs in the world and nothing's going to happen. So in a way, it depends on the individual's desire to change his situation or her situation.
Yeah, I agree with that. Thank you. Now, I want us to focus on another topic that I know interests you because you mentioned this about your investigation, and that is the prison guards. Because normally people think a lot about the inmates and most of the programs and strategies are focused on them, but these guards are mostly forgotten. I believe that that's the case also in the U.S. So what do you think about the guards in La Modelo? What do you think about their wages, their working conditions? Like, you were able to ask a few questions, I remember. So
yes. Well, I think the problems are universal. And in fact, the director of the prison confirmed that when I spoke to him at the end of our visit. And problems around alcoholism, drug abuse, family violence, divorce, because they're carrying a lot of stress. They are living in the same environment as the prisoners, oftentimes 8 hours, sometimes 16 hours a day. And it takes a toll on them. Prisons are traumatizing environments, and not only the prisoners are traumatized, but the people who work in them, both by the conditions of the prison and the environment, but also when you're working with people who have been traumatized themselves, you experience vicarious secondary traumatization. And most of the prisoners, of course, are there because of violence and in their own lives. And so for the guards, my sense, having spoken to one at the end, they're not highly paid. The guards at San Quentin are paid well in comparison to jobs of that same level that do not require college education. But I think there's always the issue, if you don't pay them enough, it invites corruption. Even one of the wardens of San Quentin admitted to me one time that 90% of the contraband that enters the prison comes from the guards, not from visitors, not from chaplains, but comes from them. And I think there's always that danger. So my interest in my research was finding a way to address some of the problems that they're facing and also come up with some suggestions for how to alleviate those problems and make their lives better. Because if we can improve the life and the conditions of the guards, we will also be able to improve the conditions in the prison. If you cannot go into a prison and reform anything without the cooperation of the people who work there, especially the guards, and if they don't want to, if they don't like the reforms, they will do everything they can to sabotage.
Yeah, that's true. And actually, that was my next question regarding corruption inside prisons. I think that we cannot say this for sure, and obviously not the people that we met there or anything, because we don't know, but they are paid like 3 minimum wages here, like the equivalent. So that's not a lot for that kind of job. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I also noticed was that there are not many of them. So yes, I think that for a prison like La Modelo that has 3,500 inmates, probably they would need like around 300 or 400 people, guards, to be able to control that prison. Mm-hmm. However, they have like around 120. Right. So that's not a lot of people. And I feel that could be intimidating. So also that environment of like fear and intimidation from the inmates themselves can be impacting them and like also forcing them to be corrupt. And they also have to, I don't know, maybe make up for their low wages. I don't know.
It's possible. I did notice there seemed to be fewer guards than a typical day at San Quentin. Now, I know they were also doing searches in a part of the prison, so they may have diverted some of them. But I think what I find remarkable is, despite the fact that the guards I've worked with, most of them are very professional, very good people who want to do a good job and are not corrupt. It's really a minority of people who are. But I do think that the environment lends itself to corruption at times. But I think the more serious problem, in a sense, is because you'll always have contraband in there, no matter the stuff is going to get in there one or the other. But I think the real issue is, how do we care for the people themselves, and because they are working in this environment where there's always the chance of violence, is always the threat of violence, and so they need to be hyper vigilant. And that takes a lot of energy. It causes stress. So I think the real question is, and not even just money, although it would be nice to pay people more, but really giving them other opportunities for self-improvement, for relaxation, for education themselves, in ways that they can decompress from the stress of being in prison all the time. Would go a long way, I think, to helping prevent some of the problems that occur in prisons when people are overstressed and underpaid.
Yeah, and we also talked to one of the guards, and he mentioned that they didn't have like specific program, like a mental health program or anything. Right. So that would be...
And that's only in the last 10 years, I'd say, that in the United States, that started to be in people's consciousness about the need for that for correction officers. They don't like to be called guards in English. But yeah, it's only recently that people have started paying attention to them.
Okay. Yeah, we definitely need to bring that here for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, wrapping up, I would like us to touch upon a subject that wasn't expected during our visit, and that was that we met 2 transgender women in the last sector of the prison where the elderly and the disabled were at. We are able to speak to them and even visit their cells. Do you consider that trans women should be in a prison for men?
It's interesting. I was surprised to see them there as well, although we do have at San Quentin, I think, 100 trans women prisoners, and they are housed directly with the cisgender male population. I don't think they should be housed in the same area because I think it invites a lot of various forms of abuse, trafficking, exploitation. And most of these women have been very much traumatized in their lives prior to coming to prison. In fact, one of the reasons most of the transgendered prisoners I've encountered in jails and prisons over the years, the reason they're in prison is that they're so desperate to change themselves that they resort to crime to pay for hormones or for surgery. They don't have the resources because it's expensive. So I think it would be more humane to house them in a separate area. Now, the other argument, though, is that it's discriminatory to separate them from other prisoners. But I think that's not a good argument because I think the problems outweigh any benefit of having them be in the middle of an environment surrounded by male inmates. Although I was also surprised that, I think the guard who was showing us around mentioned that the majority of the trans women who are at Modelo are choose to be in the general environment. Now, these are pretty tough people. They've had to fight most of their lives, so they're not necessarily victims. But I think in general, it would be more humane to treat them as women, and if you don't want to put them with the women prisoners, at least create a situation where they're going to be safe from being exploited and trafficked.
Yeah, or any kind of abuse, for sure. Well, and also regarding the trans women, do you think that the state should guarantee these women their hormone treatment while they're in prison? We even asked them if they were receiving the treatment, and they said they weren't, even though they have requested it.
Yeah, my impression was it was sort of a national shortage of hormones, not just there, but kind of everywhere. I think if, at least from the most current medical opinions that I've read, is that this is a medical issue. It's something that it would be not giving them hormones would, I think, be the equivalent to not giving a diabetic insulin. So I think, in a sense, if they've started the process, if they're in the process of transitioning, it would be, the humane thing is to permit them to have access to the hormones. I'm not sure that surgery is indicated while people who are incarcerated, because it's just the expense and the resources in prisons are so scarce. It's hard enough to get decent medical care as it is. It might be better for them to wait till they're out of prison for that. But at least in terms of the hormone treatment, I think it would be just to provide that for them while they're in.
Yeah. Father Williams, thank you so much for granting us this interview for the Javeriana Center on Government and Public Ethics podcast. Hopefully we can have you again soon. We applaud your service for the prison population who is somewhat forgotten by societies in general. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure, and I hope to be able to return to Bogota.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
This was another episode of Construyendo País. We hope you enjoyed this fascinating conversation. Don't forget to follow us on @Escuela.gov.PUJ to stay up to date with future episodes, events, and activities of the Javeriana Center on Government and Public Ethics.